The silly map my son drew of our neighborhood helped detectives identify the hit-and-run driver. Detective Raymond Cho spread my 7-year-old son's crayon drawing across the conference table at the police station, and I watched him study the crooked houses and misspelled street names with an intensity that seemed absurd given the source material. Oliver had drawn this map 3 weeks ago, during a rainy Saturday afternoon when he was bored, labeling every house on our block with elaborate details only a child would notice. Mrs. Kemper's house had 3 garden gnomes. The Alvarez family home was marked "Barking Dogs Always," and our house at the corner was identified as "Best Treehouse in America." Detective Cho pointed to a specific detail on Oliver's map, a small blue rectangle drawn in the driveway of the house belonging to Richard Donovan, our neighbor who served as deputy mayor. The rectangle had a careful label in Oliver's blocky handwriting: "Shiny truck, dark blue, big dent front." That dent matched perfectly with the paint transfer and impact pattern from the hit and run that had killed my wife, Sarah, 3 nights ago. She'd been jogging at dawn when a vehicle struck her on Maple Street 2 blocks from our home, then drove away, leaving her bleeding on the pavement. A dog walker had found her 20 minutes later. She died in the ambulance before reaching the hospital. Oliver had been sleeping when it happened, had woken to find police officers in our kitchen, and his mother gone forever. Detective Cho had initially dismissed the map when I'd brought it to the station yesterday, had looked at me with the patient sympathy reserved for grieving widowers grasping at straws. But his partner, Detective Lisa Kramer, had noticed the detail about the dent and insisted they follow up. Richard Donovan owned a dark blue Silverado pickup truck. I'd seen it in his driveway countless times without ever noticing any damage. But Oliver had noticed because children notice everything adults ignore. He'd been fascinated by that dent, had asked me repeatedly why Mr. Donovan didn't fix his truck. I told him some people didn't care about dents, that it was none of our business. Now that dent was potentially evidence in my wife's murder. Detective Cho called his forensics team and requested an immediate inspection of Donovan's vehicle. I sat in the conference room while officers drove to Donovan's house to conduct a voluntary vehicle inspection. Richard had agreed readily when they'd called, had said he was happy to help the investigation in any way possible, had expressed his condolences about Sarah's death. He'd been at our house the day after it happened, had brought a casserole and offered his assistance with anything we needed, had hugged me and told Oliver that his mother was in heaven watching over him. If Richard Donovan had killed my wife, he'd done it with extraordinary calm and then attended her impromptu memorial with apparent genuine grief. The forensics call came 90 minutes later. Detective Cho put it on speaker so I could hear. The technician's voice was measured, but excited. The dent on the front driver's side bumper contains paint transfer consistent with the victim's running jacket. Fabric fibers embedded in the impact point match the clothing she was wearing. The damage pattern is consistent with a pedestrian strike at approximately 35 to 40 miles per hour. This is your vehicle. Detective Cho thanked him and hung up, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "We have probable cause now. We'll be arresting Richard Donovan within the hour." I asked why Donovan would have killed Sarah, what possible motive he could have. Detective Kramer explained that hit and run didn't always mean intent to kill, that Donovan might have been drunk or distracted, might have panicked after the impact and fled rather than face consequences. The crime was the fleeing, not necessarily the initial collision. But something about that explanation felt insufficient. Sarah had been jogging the same route at the same time every morning for 3 years. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her routine. If Richard had hit her accidentally, he would have known immediately who the victim was. He would have known he'd killed his neighbor's wife, and he'd still driven away and then brought us a casserole the next day. I went home to relieve my mother, who'd been watching Oliver while I dealt with police procedures and funeral arrangements. Oliver was drawing again, another map, this one of the park where Sarah used to take him. My mother pulled me aside in the kitchen and asked if there was any progress in the investigation. I told her they'd identified a suspect and would be making an arrest. I didn't tell her who, didn't want to speak that betrayal out loud yet. Oliver came into the kitchen and asked when Mommy was coming home, a question he'd asked 17 times since Thursday, despite being told repeatedly that she was dead. His 7-year-old brain couldn't process permanent loss, kept expecting her to walk through the door with groceries or come upstairs to tuck him in. I knelt down and held his shoulders and told him again that Mommy was gone, that she wasn't coming back, that we would miss her together forever. Oliver started crying, and I held him while my mother turned away to hide her own tears. When Oliver calmed down, I told him that his map had helped the police, that his drawing was going to help find the person who hurt Mommy. He looked up at me with red eyes and asked if drawing more maps would help. I told him maybe, but right now he should just draw whatever made him happy. Richard Donovan was arrested at 4 p.m. that afternoon. I watched from my living room window as police cars surrounded his house and officers led him out in handcuffs. He was shouting about his rights, about how this was a mistake, about his position as deputy mayor. His wife Barbara stood in the doorway crying. Their teenage son Kyle watched from an upstairs window with an expression of shock. Our other neighbors came out to watch, forming small clusters on sidewalks and lawns, whispering to each other about what was happening. The Kempers looked horrified. The Alvarez family stood together on their porch, the father with his arm around his wife. Within an hour, news vans were arriving. reporters setting up cameras and doing stand-ups in front of Donovan's house. The deputy mayor arrested for vehicular homicide and leaving the scene of an accident. The victim was his neighbor. A 7-year-old boy's crayon map had provided the key evidence. It was a story made for local news cycles. My phone started ringing with reporters wanting interviews, wanting to talk about Oliver's map, wanting to photograph the drawing that had solved the case. I ignored all of them. Oliver didn't need to be turned into a media curiosity because his innocent observation had exposed a killer. Detective Cho called that evening to update me on the interrogation. Richard Donovan had lawyered up immediately, wasn't talking, was claiming complete innocence despite the forensic evidence. His attorney was already preparing motions to suppress the evidence, arguing that the map didn't constitute probable cause for the vehicle inspection. Detective Cho said the district attorney's office was confident the evidence would hold up, that the paint transfer and fiber match were irrefutable. But the legal process would take months. Donovan was being held on $500,000 bail, which his family posted within hours. He'd be out by morning, living 3 houses away from us while awaiting trial. The thought made my skin crawl. I asked Detective Cho if there was any way to prevent that, any condition that would keep Donovan away from our home. He said they'd request a stay-away order, but couldn't guarantee it would be granted. Donovan hadn't threatened us and wasn't considered a flight risk, given his community ties. The justice system had procedures, and I needed to trust the process. I told Detective Cho I'd trusted Richard Donovan for 5 years, had waved to him every morning, had borrowed his ladder when I needed to clean gutters, had attended his backyard barbecues. Trust hadn't worked out well for me. Detective Cho was sympathetic but unhelpful. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and I would need patience. Richard Donovan came home the next morning at 10 a.m. I watched from my window as his wife and son greeted him in the driveway, the 3 of them embracing while reporters photographed them from the street. Donovan looked directly at my house before going inside, made eye contact with me through the window. I couldn't read his expression. Defiance? Guilt? Calculation? Whatever it was, it made me close the curtains and double-check the locks on my doors. Oliver asked why I was being weird about the doors. I told him I was just making sure we were safe. He accepted that explanation and went back to his drawing. He was working on another map now, this one showing the route from our house to his school. Every crosswalk was carefully marked, every stop sign drawn in red crayon, every house along the way labeled with observations only a child would make. I watched him work with a mixture of pride and sadness. His attention to detail had helped catch his mother's killer, but he was 7 years old and should have been drawing dinosaurs or spaceships, not creating evidence maps for criminal investigations. The world had forced him to be useful in a way no child should have to be. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks from Donovan's arrest. The district attorney's office was treating this as a high-priority case given Donovan's public position. His attorney, a prominent defense lawyer named Gerald Stackhouse, was already conducting a media campaign suggesting his client was being railroaded due to his political position. Stackhouse gave interviews claiming the evidence was circumstantial, that the map was inadmissible, that the prosecution had violated Donovan's rights by inspecting his vehicle based on a child's drawing. He painted Richard as a dedicated public servant being destroyed by overzealous law enforcement. Meanwhile, I was planning my wife's funeral. Sarah's parents flew in from Florida, devastated and angry, wanting to know how the investigation was proceeding and whether justice would be served. I told them we had the right person in custody, that the evidence was solid, that their daughter's killer would be held accountable. But doubt gnawed at me. The legal system was complex, and wealthy defendants with good lawyers often found ways to escape consequences. Richard Donovan had resources and connections I didn't. His position as deputy mayor gave him relationships with judges, prosecutors, politicians who might be sympathetic or at least reluctant to see him convicted. I'd watched enough true crime documentaries to know that justice wasn't automatic, that the truth didn't always prevail in court. Sarah's funeral was held on a gray Wednesday morning at St. Catherine's Church. The sanctuary was packed with friends, family, colleagues from her job as a physical therapist, parents from Oliver's school, neighbors from our street. Barbara Donovan and her son Kyle attended, sitting in the back, which enraged me until I realized they had as much right to mourn Sarah as anyone. Barbara had been her friend. They'd shared coffee regularly, had coordinated school pickups, had celebrated holidays together. Whatever Richard had done didn't erase Barbara's genuine relationship with Sarah. Kyle had played with Oliver, the older boy, patiently helping the younger one learn to ride a bike and throw a football. The Donovan family's presence at the funeral was complicated and painful, a reminder that Richard's crime had devastated more than just my family. During the service, Oliver sat between me and his grandmother, clutching a photograph of Sarah. He didn't cry, just stared at her casket with an expression of confusion and loss that broke my heart repeatedly. When the priest asked if anyone wanted to share memories, several people spoke about Sarah's kindness, her dedication to her patients, her love for her family. I couldn't speak. My grief was too raw, and my rage at Richard Donovan too consuming to trust myself at the podium. After the funeral, I received a phone call from Gerald Stackhouse, Donovan's attorney. He asked if we could meet privately to discuss the case. I told him I had nothing to say to him or his client. Stackhouse said he understood my anger, but insisted there were facts about the case I should know before proceeding with prosecution. I told him any facts could be presented in court. He said that would be unfortunate for everyone involved, that some information was better shared privately, that I should think about Oliver and what was best for him in the long term. The implied threat was clear. Stackhouse was suggesting they had information that could somehow hurt me or Oliver if this went to trial. I told him to go to hell and hung up. But the call disturbed me. What could they possibly have that would make me want to drop the case against my wife's killer? I called Detective Cho and told him about Stackhouse's call. Cho said it was a standard defense tactic, trying to intimidate the victim's family into asking prosecutors to reduce charges or accept a plea deal. He advised me to document any future contact, but not to engage with Donovan's legal team. The district attorney's office would handle all communication. I should focus on taking care of Oliver and let the justice system do its job. The preliminary hearing arrived, and I sat in the courtroom's gallery with Sarah's parents while prosecutors presented their evidence. The forensic analyst testified about the paint transfer and fiber match, showed photographs of the damage to Donovan's truck, explained how the impact pattern was consistent with striking a pedestrian. Detective Kramer testified about the investigation, how they'd initially had no leads until Oliver's map provided the crucial detail about the dent. The prosecutor entered Oliver's map into evidence, and I watched the judge examine the crayon drawing with apparent fascination. Stackhouse objected strenuously, arguing that the map was hearsay, that a child's drawing couldn't establish probable cause for a vehicle inspection, that his client's Fourth Amendment rights had been violated. The judge took the arguments under consideration and said she'd rule on the admissibility question before trial. If she threw out the evidence from the truck inspection, the case would collapse. Everything depended on whether Oliver's map could legally justify examining Donovan's vehicle. Stackhouse seemed confident as he left the courtroom. The prosecutor, a woman named Catherine Velasquez, looked less certain. She told me afterward that the admissibility ruling could go either way, that case law on child-provided evidence was complicated. That evening, someone threw a brick through my living room window. The brick had a note attached. "Stop the prosecution or next time it's worse." I called 911 immediately, kept Oliver upstairs while police responded, gave a statement about the threat. Officers searched the area but found no witnesses or surveillance footage. Detective Cho arrived personally and took the brick and note for evidence analysis. He said they'd increase patrols past my house, but couldn't provide 24-hour protection. He suggested I consider staying with family until after the trial. I refused. This was our home, and I wasn't going to let threats drive us out. My mother came to stay with us that night, helped me board up the broken window, slept on the couch with a baseball bat beside her. Oliver asked about the noise in the police cars. I told him someone had accidentally thrown something at our house, that it was fixed now, that he should go back to sleep. He accepted the lie, but I could see fear in his eyes. He knew something was wrong even if he didn't understand what. The innocence that had created the map, that beautiful childlike observation of neighborhood details, was being corrupted by violence and intimidation. Whoever had thrown that brick wanted to silence a 7-year-old boy's testimony through terror. That realization made me more determined to see this through. Richard Donovan would be held accountable regardless of threats. The judge ruled 3 weeks later. Oliver's map was admissible. A child's first-hand observation documented in a drawing constituted reasonable grounds for investigation, especially when corroborated by other evidence. The vehicle inspection had been legal. The physical evidence would stand. Stackhouse immediately announced plans to appeal, but for now, the case would proceed to trial. The district attorney's office moved to expedite the trial date given the high-profile nature and the threats against my family. Trial was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, Oliver's map became famous. News outlets requested copies, legal scholars debated its implications for evidence law, online commenters argued about whether children's art could be trusted in criminal cases. Oliver didn't understand why his drawing was being discussed by strangers on television. I tried to shield him from the attention, but it was everywhere. Kids at his school asked about the map, about his mother, about the arrest. Teachers tried to maintain normalcy, but Oliver's situation dominated playground conversations. He became that kid whose mom died and whose drawing caught the killer. I hated that identity for him. Wanted him to just be Oliver, a 7-year-old who liked dinosaurs and building Lego sets, not a child whose innocent artwork had solved a homicide. 2 weeks before trial, Gerald Stackhouse called again. This time, he asked to meet in person at his office, said it was urgent and involved information about Sarah that I needed to know. I agreed reluctantly, brought Detective Cho with me. We sat in Stackhouse's expensive downtown office while he spread documents across his conference table, printouts of text messages between Sarah and Richard Donovan, dozens of them, spanning 6 months before her death. The messages were friendly at first, coordinating neighborhood events and school pickups. Then they became personal. Sarah confiding about marital stress, Richard sympathizing about his own marriage difficulties. The messages grew increasingly intimate. Plans to meet for coffee, references to conversations I knew nothing about. The final messages, sent 2 days before Sarah's death, showed them arguing. Richard saying he'd made a mistake, that he couldn't leave Barbara for her. Sarah responding that he'd led her on, that he'd promised things he never intended to deliver. The last message from Sarah. We need to talk in person tomorrow morning. This isn't over. She'd been jogging the next morning when Richard's truck struck her. The messages suggested a motive far more sinister than a hit-and-run accident. This looked like premeditated murder. Richard had killed Sarah to silence her after an affair gone wrong. I stared at those messages, feeling my reality fracture. Sarah had been having an affair with our neighbor, had been confiding relationship problems to the man she was sleeping with, had sent him dozens of messages I'd never known about. Stackhouse watched me process this information with professional sympathy. He said these messages would be entering evidence at trial, that they established Richard's motive, but also Sarah's participation in the relationship. The defense would argue that Sarah had been emotionally unstable, that she'd threatened to expose the affair and destroy Richard's marriage and political career, that Richard had panicked when she demanded a confrontation. Stackhouse said all of this in a tone that suggested reasonableness, as if Sarah's death was somehow understandable given the circumstances. Detective Cho was reading through the messages with increasing anger. He asked Stackhouse how the defense had obtained these texts, if they were on Sarah's phone, which was in police evidence. Stackhouse smiled and said the messages were recovered from Richard's phone, which was his property and which he'd provided voluntarily to his legal team. They were authentic and would be verified by forensic analysis. The prosecution would have to deal with these messages at trial. Stackhouse suggested that accepting a plea deal for involuntary manslaughter might be better than putting Oliver through a public trial where his mother's affair and the circumstances of her death would be examined in detail. It was a threat disguised as mercy. I left Stackhouse's office in shock. Detective Cho drove me home while I tried to process what I'd learned. Sarah had been unfaithful. She'd been having an affair with Richard Donovan. She'd demanded a confrontation on the morning of her death. The accident might not have been an accident at all. Richard might have deliberately run her down to silence her, or the affair story might be fabricated, texts manufactured or taken out of context to create reasonable doubt. I couldn't know what was real anymore. Everything I'd believed about my wife and our marriage was now in question. Detective Cho said the prosecution would investigate the texts' authenticity, that they'd verify when and how they were sent, that if Richard had manufactured evidence, it would be exposed. But he also warned me that if the texts were legitimate, they complicated the case significantly. A defendant with a motive looked guiltier than someone who'd accidentally struck a pedestrian. But a victim with an affair looked less sympathetic to juries. The defense would use those texts to paint Sarah as an unstable woman who'd brought her death upon herself through poor choices. Character assassination was effective legal strategy, even when the victim was dead and couldn't defend themselves. I needed to prepare for Sarah's reputation to be destroyed in court. That night, I went through Sarah's belongings looking for evidence of the affair, searched her phone records, her email, her social media, found nothing that suggested a relationship with Richard Donovan beyond neighborly friendship. If the texts were real, she'd been extraordinarily careful about hiding them. Or perhaps she'd deleted other evidence. I checked our phone bills for unknown numbers, found several calls to a number I didn't recognize. Reverse lookup showed it registered to a prepaid phone purchased with cash. Sarah had been calling a burner phone regularly for 6 months, the same phone that showed up as R in her contacts. My wife had been conducting a secret relationship with enough sophistication to avoid leaving obvious trails. How had I missed this? Were there signs I'd ignored? Late nights explained as work commitments, weekend errands that took hours longer than they should, distance in our intimacy that I'd attributed to stress and routine. Had I been willfully blind or genuinely oblivious? The questions consumed me. I wanted to confront Sarah, demand explanations, hear her side of this story. But she was dead and had taken her truth with her. All I had were text messages from Richard's phone and my own doubts about everything I'd thought I knew about my marriage. The next morning, I went to see Barbara Donovan, rang her doorbell at 8 a.m. while Kyle was at school and reporters had temporarily scattered. She opened the door looking exhausted and defeated. I asked if we could talk privately. She invited me in reluctantly, led me to her kitchen where we sat across from each other at the table where Sarah and I had attended dinner parties. I asked Barbara directly if she'd known about the affair. Her face crumbled and she started crying. She said she'd suspected for months, but had no proof until the text messages surfaced during Richard's legal defense. Said Richard had denied everything when she'd confronted him about late nights and strange behavior. Said she'd chosen to believe him because the alternative meant her marriage was a lie. Now she was facing the possibility that her husband had not only cheated, but had killed his mistress to keep the affair secret. Her children were being destroyed by this scandal. Kyle had been bullied mercilessly at school. Their daughter at college was considering dropping out because of the attention. Barbara's own career as a school principal was in jeopardy because of her association with Richard. She looked at me with genuine anguish and asked what I wanted from her. I told her I needed to know the truth. Had Richard killed Sarah deliberately, or was it an accident? Did she believe her husband was capable of murder? Barbara said she didn't know what to believe anymore. The Richard she'd been married to for 23 years wasn't capable of murder, but he was apparently capable of affairs and lies and elaborate deception. So maybe he was also capable of worse things than she'd imagined. She said Richard maintained his innocence. claimed the collision was purely accidental, that he'd been distracted by his phone and hadn't seen Sarah jogging until it was too late, that he'd panicked after hitting her and had driven away in shock, that he'd realized within minutes what a terrible mistake he'd made, but by then, it was too late to go back, that he'd brought the casserole to our house the next day because he genuinely hadn't known the victim was Sarah until he saw the news reports. This story contradicted the affair narrative, and Barbara acknowledged the inconsistency. She didn't know which version her husband was lying about. Maybe both stories were false. Maybe he'd deliberately killed Sarah because of the affair and then fabricated the accidental collision story as a legal defense. Or maybe the texts were real, but the killing was still accidental, and the timing was horrific coincidence. Barbara said she couldn't live in this uncertainty anymore. She was filing for divorce regardless of the trial outcome. Her marriage was over, and she needed to protect herself and her children from whatever came next. I left Barbara's house feeling no closer to understanding the truth. The trial was 2 weeks away, and I still didn't know if my wife had been unfaithful, if her death was murder or manslaughter, if I was mourning a woman I'd actually known or a stranger who'd hidden her real self from me. I picked Oliver up from school that afternoon and watched him in the rearview mirror during the drive home. He was drawing again, another map, this one showing the route we were taking. Every landmark carefully noted, every turn documented. The same obsessive attention to detail that had helped catch Richard Donovan. I asked Oliver why he liked drawing maps so much. He said maps helped him understand where things were, that when he drew something, he remembered it better, that making maps made him feel safe because he always knew how to get home. That answer broke something in me. My son was drawing maps to feel safe in a world that had become terrifyingly unpredictable. His mother was dead. His neighborhood was full of reporters and police cars. Strangers on television discussed his artwork, and he was coping by trying to document and control his environment through drawings. I pulled over and hugged him fiercely, told him I loved him and would keep him safe no matter what happened. Oliver hugged me back and asked if I was sad because of Mommy. I told him yes, I was very sad, but being with him made it better. He accepted that and went back to his drawing. The trial began on a Monday morning in late September. The courtroom was packed with reporters, spectators, Sarah's family, and Barbara Donovan, who sat as far from her husband as possible. Richard sat at the defense table in an expensive suit looking composed and confident. I sat behind the prosecution table with Sarah's parents, all of us wearing photographs of Sarah as pins on our clothing. The jury was selected over 2 days, 12 people who would decide whether Richard Donovan was guilty of vehicular homicide and leaving the scene. Catherine Velasquez gave the opening statement for the prosecution, methodically laying out the evidence. The impact pattern, the paint transfer, the fiber match, Oliver's map documenting the pre-existing dent. The circumstantial evidence of Richard's truck leaving his driveway at 5:45 a.m. on the morning Sarah died. Security camera footage from a neighbor's house showing a vehicle matching Richard's truck, driving away from the direction of the accident at 6:03 a.m. The timeline fit perfectly. Richard had struck Sarah at approximately 6 a.m., had driven home immediately, and had hidden the evidence by parking his damaged truck in his garage. Gerald Stackhouse's opening statement for the defense acknowledged that Richard's truck had struck Sarah, but argued this was a tragic accident, not a crime. Richard had been driving distracted, hadn't seen the jogger until impact, had panicked and fled in shock. A terrible mistake, compounded by a moment of weakness. But the defense would show that Sarah wasn't an innocent victim. She'd been having an affair with Richard, had threatened to expose it, had demanded a confrontation on the morning of her death. The collision was accidental, but the circumstances surrounding it were complicated by Sarah's own choices. The first week of trial focused on forensic evidence. Experts testified about the paint transfer, the impact pattern, the damage to Richard's truck. Detective Kramer walked the jury through the investigation, showed Oliver's map enlarged on a screen, explained how that detail had provided the crucial lead. When Catherine Velasquez asked Detective Kramer to describe Oliver's map, she emphasized that it showed remarkable observation skills for a 7-year-old, that the dent notation was one of dozens of accurate details about the neighborhood. The jury studied the map carefully. Several jurors were visibly moved by the crayon drawing, the childish handwriting, the innocent precision of a boy documenting his world without knowing it would become evidence in his mother's murder trial. Stackhouse's cross-examination of Detective Kramer focused on the reliability of children's observations, suggesting that Oliver might have noticed the dent after the accident and backdated it in his memory. Detective Kramer testified that the map had been drawn 3 weeks before Sarah's death, based on the date Oliver had written at the top, and had been witnessed by me, his grandmother, and his teacher, who'd seen him working on it during indoor recess. The dent documentation was contemporaneous and reliable. Stackhouse couldn't shake that testimony, but planted seeds of doubt about whether the dent had been visible to anyone else, or if only Oliver claimed to have seen it. The second week of trial brought the affair evidence. Stackhouse put a digital forensics expert on the stand who verified that the text messages between Sarah and Richard were authentic, sent from their phones over a 6-month period. The expert walked through timestamps, metadata, and verification procedures. The messages were real. Sarah had been having an affair with Richard Donovan. The courtroom erupted when the messages were read aloud. Sarah's parents sat in stunned silence. I closed my eyes and listened to my wife's words expressing affection for another man, frustration with our marriage, plans for secret meetings. The jury heard every message, including Sarah's demand for a confrontation 2 days before her death. Stackhouse argued this established motive and context, that Richard had been trapped in an affair he regretted with a woman who threatened to destroy his career and marriage. The prosecution's cross-examination focused on the fact that motive made the killing look more intentional, not less. If Richard feared Sarah's threat enough to panic, why hadn't he simply ended the affair and dealt with the consequences? Why wait until the morning she demanded a confrontation? Catherine Velasquez suggested the texts actually supported premeditation, that Richard had decided to silence Sarah permanently rather than face exposure. I testified on day 8 of the trial. Catherine Velasquez asked me to describe my marriage to Sarah, our life together, Oliver's drawings, the morning I'd discovered my wife was dead. I told the truth as I'd known it. We'd been happy, or so I'd thought. We'd had normal marital stresses, but nothing that suggested infidelity. Sarah had been a devoted mother, a dedicated physical therapist, a caring partner. She'd had regular routines, including her morning jogs. Oliver had loved creating maps and drawings, had been fascinated by neighborhood details, had documented his observations compulsively. The map that helped identify Richard's truck was one of dozens Oliver had created. He'd drawn it weeks before Sarah's death purely because he enjoyed making maps. I'd thought it was silly at the time, had been mildly annoyed by the clutter of drawings accumulating in our house. Now I was grateful for Oliver's obsessive documentation. Stackhouse's cross-examination was brutal. He asked if I'd noticed any changes in Sarah's behavior in the months before her death. Late nights? Unexplained absences? Distance in our relationship? I admitted there had been some changes, but I'd attributed them to work stress. Stackhouse suggested I'd been willfully blind to my wife's affair, that the signs had been obvious to anyone paying attention. He asked if I'd been angry when I'd learned about the affair. I said of course I was angry, devastated, betrayed. Stackhouse asked if that anger made me want to see Richard Donovan convicted, regardless of whether he was actually guilty of murder or just guilty of being my wife's lover. I told him I wanted justice for Sarah's death, not revenge for her infidelity. Stackhouse looked skeptical. Oliver was scheduled to testify, but the judge ruled he was too young to be reliable under cross-examination. Instead, his map spoke for him. The drawing remained entered as evidence, displayed frequently during testimony, referenced by both sides. The prosecution argued it was innocent documentation that happened to capture crucial evidence. The defense argued it was an unreliable child's drawing that shouldn't determine a man's fate. The jury studied it constantly. During breaks, I saw jurors looking at the enlarged photograph of Oliver's map, tracing the careful labels and crayon houses. Whatever verdict they reached would be partly determined by whether they believed a 7-year-old's artistic observation or not. The case ultimately came down to intent. Everyone agreed Richard's truck had struck Sarah. The physical evidence was irrefutable. The question was whether it had been an accident compounded by panic or a deliberate act of violence to silence a threatening mistress. The prosecution argued that Richard had means, motive, and opportunity. He'd been having an affair, facing exposure, and had chosen murder over consequences. The defense argued that affairs happened constantly without leading to murder, that the timing was tragic coincidence, that Richard had simply been distracted and had made a terrible mistake that he'd then compounded by fleeing. Both narratives fit the evidence. The jury would decide which story they believed. Closing arguments happened on day 14 of the trial. Catherine Velasquez summarized the evidence methodically. The forensics proving Richard's truck struck Sarah, the timeline showing he'd fled the scene immediately, the affair providing motive, the timing of Sarah's demands for confrontation, the lies Richard had told afterward, bringing a casserole while his damaged truck sat hidden in his garage, the exploitation of his position as deputy mayor to project innocence while secretly guilty. She held up Oliver's map and told the jury that sometimes the clearest truth came from the most innocent source, that a 7-year-old boy's careful documentation had exposed what investigators might have missed. The map didn't lie. Children didn't engage in cover-ups or political calculations. Oliver had simply drawn what he saw, and in doing so, had caught his mother's killer. Gerald Stackhouse's closing argument acknowledged the tragedy, but insisted the prosecution had failed to prove intent. Richard had been distracted by his phone, hadn't seen the jogger, had struck her accidentally, and had panicked. A series of terrible mistakes that ended with a woman dead and a man facing decades in prison for vehicular manslaughter. The affair was regrettable, but irrelevant to the legal question of intent. The map was a child's drawing, not forensic evidence. The jury should find Richard guilty of leaving the scene, but not of intentional homicide. The jury deliberated for 4 days. I spent those days in a hotel near the courthouse, unable to return home where everything reminded me of Sarah and the life we'd had before truth and tragedy had destroyed it. Oliver stayed with my mother, insulated from the verdict watch and media circus. Sarah's parents prayed constantly, convinced that justice would prevail. I had no such confidence. The justice system was imperfect and juries unpredictable. Richard Donovan had the resources to mount a sophisticated defense, had lawyers who'd created reasonable doubt where none should exist. I prepared myself for the possibility that he'd be acquitted or convicted of lesser charges that would see him serve minimal time. On the fourth day of deliberations, my phone rang. The jury had reached a verdict. I called my mother to tell her, called Sarah's parents, called Detective Cho. We assembled in the courtroom 30 minutes later. The jury filed in, looking exhausted. The foreperson handed the verdict form to the bailiff, who gave it to the judge. Judge Carolyn Hughes read it silently, then asked Richard to stand. She read the verdict aloud. Guilty of vehicular homicide in the first degree. Guilty of leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death. Guilty on all counts. Richard's face went white. Barbara Donovan started crying. Sarah's mother collapsed in her seat, sobbing with relief. I felt nothing at first, then everything at once. Relief and rage and grief and vindication and emptiness. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. During that time, Catherine Velasquez filed additional motions presenting evidence that had been excluded from trial. Richard's computer history showed searches for how to fake vehicle accident and leaving accident scene penalties in the week before Sarah's death. His bank records showed withdrawals of $30,000 in cash the day after the collision, money that was never recovered or explained. A witness came forward claiming Richard had asked about hiring someone to handle a problem weeks before Sarah died. This new evidence suggested premeditation beyond what the jury had considered. The judge allowed it for sentencing purposes. At the sentencing hearing, Catherine Velasquez argued for the maximum sentence, 25 years to life. Gerald Stackhouse argued for leniency given Richard's age and community service. I was allowed to make a victim impact statement. I stood before the court and spoke directly to Richard for the first time since his arrest. I told him that he'd taken Oliver's mother, my wife, Sarah's parents' daughter, that his actions had traumatized my son and destroyed our family, that he'd exploited his position and community standing to hide his crime, that he'd attended Sarah's funeral knowing he'd killed her, that he'd brought us a casserole while evidence sat in his garage, that he'd tried to use Sarah's infidelity to excuse his murder. I told him I hoped he spent every day of his sentence thinking about the moment of impact, about Sarah's last moments of consciousness, about the family he'd destroyed through his selfishness and cowardice. Judge Hughes sentenced Richard Donovan to 23 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for 15 years. She cited the aggravating factors, the abuse of public trust, the lies and deception, the evidence of premeditation, the devastating impact on a child who'd lost his mother. She noted that Oliver's map had been crucial to solving this case, that a 7-year-old's innocent observation had accomplished what adult investigators had initially missed. She said the map would be preserved as part of the court record, a testament to how truth could emerge from unexpected sources. Richard was led away in handcuffs. Barbara Donovan left the courtroom immediately. Sarah's parents hugged me and cried. Detective Cho shook my hand and said justice had been served. Catherine Velasquez told me she'd call if the defense filed appeals. I thanked everyone and left the courthouse alone. Oliver was waiting at my mother's house, drawing another map. This one showed the courthouse and the route from there to our home. He'd labeled it Daddy's Important Trip. I hugged him and told him everything was okay now, that the person who'd hurt Mommy had been punished, that we could start healing together. Oliver asked if that meant he should stop drawing maps. I told him he should draw whatever made him happy, that his maps were special and important and had helped when we needed it most. He smiled and went back to his drawing, carefully labeling each street and building with the precision that had changed everything. 2 years later, Oliver still draws maps constantly. His room is covered with them. Our neighborhood, his school, the park, the grocery store, every place we go documented in crayon and markers with meticulous detail. He's 9 now, and teachers say his spatial reasoning and observation skills are remarkable. The maps that helped convict his mother's killer have become his way of understanding and controlling his world. Richard Donovan's first appeal was denied. He'll be eligible for parole when Oliver is 22, though I'll testify at every hearing to keep him incarcerated. Sarah's betrayal still hurts, but I've made peace with not having all the answers about our marriage. What matters is that justice was served and Oliver learned that truth matters, that careful observation matters, that even a child's silly drawing can change everything.